Today, I'm going to answer the age-old question. What happens when you die? Oh, no, not that. We're going to talk about what happens to your money when you die. I'm Derek Mazzarella with Gateway Financial Partners. Hope you liked the video. If you do, like, subscribe. Got to be a shield for YouTube. You know how it works. Okay, so let's get into it. All right, basically, when you die, there are really two main types of assets. There are assets that have a beneficiary and assets without a beneficiary designation. So typically assets with a beneficiary designation are going to be things like a 401k, IRAs, annuities. Basically, you've usually at one point fill out a form, also life insurance, that's the big one. You're filling out a form that declares if I die, the assets are going to go to this person. So you can have a primary beneficiary, who's the first person in line. You could also typically have contingent beneficiaries. So in case something happens to your primary beneficiary, the assets go to essentially your backup beneficiary. Now, there's also assets that people have that don't have a beneficiary designation. So most common item that people have is their house. So real estate. So if you have any real estate, whether it's investment or the house that you own, some investment accounts, and other things that most people may not have, but in case you do, things like arts and collectibles. Basically, anything that doesn't have a beneficiary designation would fall in this category. Sometimes investment accounts, you may want to try and put what's called a transfer on death, and that'll move an investment account over to the beneficiary designation side. So if you do have an investment account, one easy way to kind of shift this off your plate is to name a beneficiary or do a joint with rights of survivorship, where that person also gets access to the account, but then when you die, they do have the ability to just kind of take over the account without much fuss. So maybe thinking, okay, well, what does that really mean? Okay, I've got a beneficiary designation, but I did my estate planning. I have a will. Not that will. I have a will, so that'll just say, okay, I want my house to go to my kids, right? Not exactly. So when you have a will is more of a wish list. It's going to tell people, okay, I would prefer to have my house go to my children or go to my grandchildren or go to a charity, whatever. But what has to happen first is actually the property goes through probate first. Now, if you're not familiar with the probate process, basically, you have a trustee or executor. They're going to look at your will and they're going to say, okay, what's my wish list? But typically the probate process is kind of convoluted. It could be a long process. You're typically going to have to go to probate court. You may have to hire a probate attorney, which is going to cost definitely some dough. And what happens in that process, they're just looking at the will and saying, okay, we see you have these assets. We see the will is going to go along to these people. Do any of the people have claim to your estate? So you may have a cousin that you hate that may claim your estate, or a child that you don't want to have access to some of your assets. They can actually stake claim to some of the assets you have, and it could be kind of a bit of a court mess. They're also going to make sure you have to pay off all your debts and taxes. So this can be a long process. It can be an expensive process. And one other downside of probate is most people aren't aware of this, but it does become public knowledge. So if you go through the probate process, people are going to know what you have for assets because it's all public record. So how do you avoid probate with these non-beneficiary designated assets? There's one option: trust. So with a trust, there's two main types of trust. There's revocable and irrevocable. Revocable means you maintain control, and I do have a trust video, so if you want to get more of the details on that, watch that trust video. But basically, the irrevocable trust, you give up total control of the assets. So with a revocable trust, basically you want to maybe put the house in the trust name. So now the house becomes the owner, the investment account, the trust becomes the owner with revocable. With that, you can still live in the house. You still have control over the assets. Really, you're just shifting ownership to the trust. And when you do that, you're going to avoid the probate process. Same thing happens with the irrevocable trust, but you essentially give up control. So if you're not in a tax saving environment, or that's not your strategy, I typically wouldn't recommend irrevocable trust in these scenarios just to avoid probate. If you really just want to avoid probate, revocable trusts are usually the way to go. There's also one other thing that you can do that's maybe not as intensive as a revocable trust. You can do what's called a pour over will. And what that does is when you die, it basically sets up a trust and it acts as a catch-all. So any of those assets that you have that don't have the beneficiary designation will automatically go into this pour over will, and it creates a trust at your death. So this way you don't have to worry about anything in terms of control with your assets being owned by the trust. So the trust is created and it kind of pulls in all these different assets at the time of death. So just to recap, you have beneficiary designations with your common assets like IRAs, 401ks. You really want to make sure that those are tight. So review those every couple of years. Make sure you have the right beneficiary designations, especially if you ever change jobs and you have old 401ks. People tend to not update those as frequently or look at them as much as they should. So feel free to do that. 2 is look at the non-beneficiary designated assets. And is there an easy way to add them a beneficiary designation, like with the investment account? Can you add a transfer on death? Go ahead and do that, because that is an easy way to just make sure that those are transferred to the person that you want to and can avoid probate. And then 2, for the remaining assets you can't make beneficiary designations for, think about putting them in a trust or creating a pour over will, because that can avoid probate. Once again, probate can be costly. People can stake claim to your assets. It becomes public, and it lengthens the process of your beneficiaries actually obtaining the assets. So you can avoid that by setting up trusts or doing a pour over will. Derek Mazzarella with Gateway Financial Partners. I hope you enjoyed the video. Once again, if you want a little bit more primer on trusts themselves, check out the trust basic video I created. Enjoy the rest of your day. And once again, please feel free to like and subscribe the video.